Hi folks, welcome back to the Ysolda Knits podcast. If you're new here, I'm Ysolda. I'm a knitwear designer based in Edinburgh, Scotland. And today I'm going to be talking about my brand new pattern, the Gullane Tank. Because editing takes so long, I'm actually recording this before the pattern release, but hopefully by the time you come to watch it, the pattern will be out and available, and I will pop links to where you can purchase the pattern in the show notes down below. You can always purchase my patterns on my website, ysolda.com, and on Ravelry. It doesn't really make any difference to me where you purchase from. I know some people sometimes message to ask, which supports me better, which is really thoughtful and lovely, but it really doesn't make any difference. So whichever platform you prefer to purchase from. If you do buy on ysolda.com, you will be able to add your pattern to your Ravelry library in case you like to store your patterns in there. We also have a newish feature on our own website where you can log in and access all of your previous purchases all in one place, and access pattern updates or download your files from there. So if you don't use Ravelry, that might be handy to know. I'm wearing the Gullane Tank today. I've really been enjoying wearing this pattern this summer. It's lovely and sort of lightweight and drapey. It's nice. It hasn't actually been very warm in Scotland most of the time, but I have really been enjoying wearing it when it has been nicer. And we did a photo shoot a couple of weeks ago and got some pictures on the beach. I'll put up some of the actual pattern photos from our photo shoot that we did this summer in kind of a slideshow, so you can see more clearly the kind of overall shape of the garment, how it looks when modelled when I'm not sort of sitting at a table. It's worked top down. I'll go through the construction in a little bit more detail in a moment, but it's worked top down with the option of making it with side seams or seamless. I am going to go over why you might want to knit it with side seams or not. It's not just personal preference, there are some practical reasons why you might want to choose to knit it with seams. And the pattern includes 14 sizes. It's roughly equivalent to an extra small, maybe an extra small, to about a 7XL. As I'm sure you're aware, clothing sizes throughout the sort of fashion industry are in no way standardized. But I wanted to give you that as a little kind of rough guide to whether you can expect the pattern to fit your size. And the pattern also includes cup shaping for 4 different options for every size. So if you find that most patterns don't fit your bust without some extra maths, without some extra work to adapt the pattern, I'm hoping that Gullane will work for you as written, or as close as possible to as written. And what I want to focus on mostly in this episode is really how I developed the cup shaping, how it works, what it's like to knit, and also some of the sort of nerdy math details behind it. So I hope you enjoy nerding out over garment fit and shaping. That's definitely the feedback I've been getting so far on this, so I have got some more for you today for sure. Before we get into those nerdy details, I thought I'd just give you a little look at the actual pattern. So it's got a cover, and I'll pop this up in the screen so it's easier for you to see. And then because the pattern has so many size options between the different directions for knitting flat and in the round, all the cup shaping options, it's a lot of pages. So to make it easier to navigate your way through, there is a table of contents. And if you're using that on a digital device, all of those pages are hyperlinked, so you can just click through to the page you need. So that can be really helpful. This is just sort of the description of the pattern. And then this is kind of all the initial info that you need. So the yarn, the gauge, the needle sizes, a bit of information about choosing your size. I am going to talk a bit more about how to take your measurements and choose your size in this episode, because I know it can be really confusing. And then we've got tables of measurements for both your body, and here's the schematic, and then more measurement charts for the finished garment measurements. So almost always there's a difference between your body measurements and your finished garment measurements. I'll go into more of that when I talk about how to choose a size, but the pattern does include tables of both measurements so that you've got all of the information you need to make an informed choice. And then we've got the yarn information with yardage in yards and meters. And because for the cup shaping you are adding extra fabric, there are separate yardages for each variation in cup size within each size. And then obviously a list of abbreviations, that's pretty standard. Some links to handy tutorials, and then the directions start. And another way that we tried to make it easier to navigate this pattern, Bex, who does all of our pattern layouts, is really good at making patterns that are clear and easy to follow. And one thing that we did was I did these little illustrations of how it kind of looks at each step, and then Bex put these in as sort of navigation guides so that you can kind of see at a glance that, oh, I'm knitting the back right now, this is the right page. And that's just a little extra thing in addition to the tables of contents. So yeah, and this is like the actual pattern directions. As you can see, lots of options, but we've also tried to make it so that if, for example, you're knitting the C to D cup variation, all of the instructions you need for each section will be on their own page. So you could go through and only print, if you like to print out patterns, you could go through and only print out the relevant pages for the sort of shape that you're knitting and ignore all of the pages that are for the other cup sizes. They're not kind of merged together on the same pages. And if you are interested in making Gullane, but maybe you're not ready to cast on, or you're trying to work out what yarn to order before you buy the pattern, it sounds very organized. I definitely commend you for that. We've also made an info PDF that's got all of that initial information, like the full sizing charts, which were cumbersome to put on a website. So the website has the sort of basic sizing information, and then we made a PDF that has all of the charts that are in the actual pattern and the yardage, plus a list of yarn substitution ideas. I have not tested all of those, but some of them are yarns that our preview knitters used and we're happy with. Some are just yarns that seem like they would be a good fit. So as always, if you are substituting a yarn, swatch, decide if you're happy with your swatch. I would always recommend, whether you're substituting a yarn or not, but if you're knitting a garment, I would always recommend washing and blocking your swatch. If you are using a plant-based yarn or a yarn with a decent percentage of plant fibers or silk, sometimes even superwash wool, I would also consider hanging your swatch, just to get an idea of whether when you wear your garment it's likely to stretch out lengthwise, because that will give you a better indication of what needle size to use. Because you want your kind of blocked, hung maybe swatch, you want the gauge after all of that to match the gauge in the pattern. It doesn't matter too much what your gauge is before you do that, other than it can be helpful to keep a note of it so that you can check your project and check that your project's on track. If you do want more information on how to swatch, especially for a garment, we do have a blog post with a lot more detail about that and some reference images. So I will also include a link to that in the show notes. Speaking of yarn, for my Gullane sample, I used Sandnes Lina, which I was really happy with. It's got a really soft hand, it drapes well right off the bat. It doesn't have the crunchiness that a lot of linen has, and it sort of feels like worn in linen. So I was really happy with it, I enjoyed knitting with it, and I really like the finished garment as well. So I certainly recommend that, but as I said, that info PDF does have a list of other yarn ideas, and we will be putting up posts about our preview knitters, and they've also mostly linked their projects to the Ravelry product listing, so you can have a look at what they used as well and see Gullane knit up in lots of different yarns. We definitely don't restrict our preview knitters to working with a particular yarn. I think it's more helpful for all of you to see the projects in different yarns and sort of see how it works. So do have a look at those if you want to see the pattern in some different yarns and see how they worked out. I really wanted Gullane to be the kind of simple basic that you reach for again and again in your wardrobe, that's easy to style, that goes with lots of things, and that's comfortable to wear. So it is a really simple pattern. It has just a few basic design details, and I'm really happy with how those worked out and how well those translated when our preview knitters knit them as well. All of the projects look amazing. So it's definitely a wardrobe basic. I've already heard from several of our preview knitters that they're planning on making more than one, which as a designer is so encouraging and feels like I kind of nailed that brief that I gave myself. And we're kind of describing Gullane as a summer tank, but a couple of our preview knitters did use wool yarns, and when I was sort of styling it with outfits for the photo shoot, I did try it on with like a shirt dress and layered as more of a sort of slipover or vest, whatever you call those garments. In the UK it can confusingly also be a tank top, but I didn't end up actually taking any photos of the dress at the moment, but I'm hoping that we can do some more kind of into the autumn and show how versatile it is. It definitely works as a layering piece, and there's no reason you couldn't use a summer yarn and still layer it into the sort of autumn, early spring, and have something that's more versatile in your wardrobe. And some of those little design details are the sloped back shoulders. So that sort of diagonal shoulder line where all of the slope of the shoulder is worked on the back is often called English tailoring. It's a really common technique in ready-to-wear knitwear, especially higher-end ready-to-wear knitwear, and it's something I've seen for a long time in hand knitting, but I feel like it's really grown in popularity over the last few years. I know the designer Coco Knits published a book where her Coco Knits method starts off with an English tailored shoulder. I've seen it from lots of other designers. It's something I was experimenting with back when I wrote Little Red in the City in like, what was that, 2009? I think 2008, 2009. The Kriya cardigan pattern has that sort of slope only on the back shoulder. Not sure I even knew the term English tailoring back then, but it is a really lovely technique. You can use it with drop shoulders, which this is basically a drop shoulder without any sleeves, or you can use it with set-in sleeves, and I like it. I feel like it just creates this really nice shoulder where the front shoulder is kind of uninterrupted. I'm going to be careful of my mic today. My sort of on-camera mic wasn't working, so I've got this little lapel mic, but I'm really nervous now that I'm going to make lots of crackling sounds pointing at the garment. But yeah, English tailoring, I like that you get this sort of smooth shoulder over the front, and all the shaping is in the back, and it's also, it creates an angle, because basically when you're putting your front and back shaping together, you end up with an angle that's twice as steep as just one of those would be. It's like adding, if you have a wedge and then you add another wedge the same size, the angle of that whole wedge is bigger. Hopefully that makes sense. And that creates an angle that in knitting is easier to knit with increases or decreases. You get pretty much the exact right angle for most people's shoulders by if you're working top down, increasing on every row. And so that can make the kind of edge of that shoulder line a really nice detail. I also find that shoulders work better with seams, or the kind of structure of something that might not be a sewn seam but has a similar structure. In this case, stitches for the front are picked up from the back shoulders, and that really has the same kind of although you're doing it on the needles, it has the same structural integrity as a sewn seam, and that structure is just so important so that the shoulders don't just stretch out of shape. I wouldn't ever want to do just something like Kitchener stitch or a provisional cast on for a shoulder seam, because you might get a beautiful smooth look, but it is just going to stretch out of shape. And the shoulders are really where your garment hangs from, so they're really, really crucial to the fit. So I like this method because you get that structural integrity and you can create a really beautiful design detail with that diagonal line of increases. In this case, I used lifted increases, which is one of my favorite techniques. It's not usually the first increase that people learn, but I would say it's no more difficult than something like a knit front and back or a make one. And again, we do have a full tutorial for lifted increases with step-by-step photos and a video. It's linked in the pattern, and I'll also put a link down below. If you haven't tried that technique, I really love it. And I love it for things like this because if you're working top down, you basically end up with half of a stitch at the edge of your next to your increase. Creates this beautiful kind of prominent stitch line, and those stitches, because it's half a stitch and the stitch next to it, those stitches look like they're the right way up. They're like V-shaped once you're wearing the garment. So that's one reason I really like lifted increases. I like using them in cases like this for shoulder shaping. The other design details, the V-neck, of course. It's quite a deep V-neck, but then it has a fairly wide band, so obviously everyone has their own preferences on whether they even like a V-neck or whether how deep they prefer a V-neck to be. But I would expect it to be kind of work appropriate, I guess, in most environments for most people. Is probably the best way to describe how deep the V-neck is. And then this ribbed neckband is worked by picking up stitches at the end. And I really love the simplicity of the center double decrease at that V. It creates a really nice crisp finish and you get that nice crisp V. So I was really happy with that. And then the other small design detail is the split hem. That works really well for like a breezy garment like this. It can make the fit a little bit more flexible in the hips, and that split can help the whole thing hang well if you aren't tucking it in. I liked Gullane tucked and untucked, but yeah, I like how that split kind of helps the whole thing drape and hang well, and it's a nice little sort of polished detail for the finished garment. We're calling it a tank top. I went back and forth on is it a tank top or a t-shirt, because it's almost like it has a cap sleeve because it has this extended shoulder line, but there's no actual sleeve added, so sticking with tank top. Feel free to disagree on that designation. And those sleeves are just finished with a simple ribbed band. One thing in terms of the sizing that you might notice is that different sizes have really different amounts of shaping in this kind of armhole area. And that's because I wanted the kind of shoulder width and how far down your arm the shoulders would extend to be consistent across the whole size range. And because the difference between shoulder width and chest circumference is not, the proportions aren't the same. So as you go up a size chart, the difference between those two measurements gets larger and larger. And because of that, in order to have something where the shoulder width of the garment matches or has the same proportional relationship with the shoulder width of body, then you need more shaping in that armhole area as you go up the size chart. So you will notice that that flat, the two sizes from kind of opposite ends of the size chart will look very different. On the body, the goal is that they look much more like the same design than they would if they looked the same flat. So hopefully that makes sense. I wanted to go through the construction in a bit more detail, and maybe that will kind of make that clearer too if you're like, what are you talking about with all these proportions and different shaping? So you start working on Gullane on the upper back, and you cast on across what will eventually be the back of the neck. And then you work back and forth. You're making this kind of trapezoid shape. I think that's what that's called. Increasing at both ends on every row. So you're getting kind of a shallow angle with those increases. And then once you've increased to the full width of your shoulders, it's actually wider than your shoulders, but the full width of the back of the garment, the upper back, then you'll work straight. How much you work straight will depend on the size you're making. If you're knitting maybe sort of, I think it's about 2/3 of the larger sizes also have increases worked before you get to the underarm. So just like you would on if you've made a set-in sleeve garment where you have a straight section and then some like sort of curves around the arm or curves around the underarm. It's the same thing here. We have some increases here. And then once you've knit that upper back section, you'll break your yarn, put your live stitches on hold. You can do it just leaving them on the needles, but it can get a bit confusing to line everything up, so it's probably easier to put them on hold. And then you're going to pick up stitches across the kind of slanted side of one of those shoulders. Something like this. So this is the back piece here. This would be the back of the neck. And then you're going to pick up stitches across one of the shoulders and start knitting a rectangle down. And once you've kind of done enough of that rectangle to kind of wrap over to the front, you'll start shaping your V-neck. So you're increasing on the neck side, and you'll keep working until, depending on the size you're making, you get down to where the sort of same level as where you started working increases to shape the kind of around the armhole on the back, and you also do that on the front. So you'll also shape the armhole at the front like this, and then you'll put these stitches on hold and go back and pick up stitches for the other shoulder. So eventually you'll have two pieces like this, and then you're going to attach them to each other by basically knitting all the way across both pieces. And if you're going to knit the body in the round, at that point you would bring in your live back stitches and knit in the round. If you're going to knit the body flat, you can choose to complete the whole of the back before you do the fronts, or work the sort of upper section, which will allow you to try things on. If you're knitting the E to F or G to H cup sizes, the V-neck, as you can see here, is slightly dropped. So you're still shaping the V-neck when you cast on the underarm here, so that the bottom of that V-neck is more kind of proportional to where the apex of your bust is. If you're bustier and you knit a V-neck without adjusting that V-neck shaping, the V-neck often ends up looking really high because your bust is kind of three-dimensional, so where this V-neck is on me will then be kind of up here somewhere. So for those larger cup sizes, the V-neck is dropped lower down. It does mean you're doing a little bit more at the same time, but the pattern does lay out what to do really clearly. There definitely aren't any instructions that are like, do this, increase this many times at this rate, and at the same time do this, and also stand on your head, and yeah. So hopefully you find those instructions easy to follow and worth it for a better fit. Once you've worked the upper, back, and front, you've actually done the most complicated parts of the pattern. The back is simply a rectangle. You can, as I said, knit that flat or in the round. So your back piece will look something like this. As I said, the amount of shaping, and therefore the amount that this section here curves, will depend on your size. And then the front section looks something like this. If you're knitting in the body and the round, then obviously your back would be joined on. Oh, skipped ahead. If you are knitting one of the larger cup size options, you will also be working some short row shaping to add a dart for the bust. I knew it had been a while since I released a garment. I think I talked about this in the first podcast episode, and I have been doing a lot of behind the scenes work on sort of how I create garment patterns, how they're graded, how the fit works. I didn't realize it had been more than 2 years until I started like putting together the marketing for this release. But apparently it has been, and at least since I released an adult garment, we did do a kids version of one of our existing sweater patterns last year. But yeah, it's been a while, and part of that is that I really wanted to get this patterns with built-in cup shaping options like right. I really wanted to get it right for as many people as possible in terms of the fit and also how easy to follow the instructions were, because once you have that many options, it's easy for just the pattern to be so confusing that it's not really any more appealing than sitting down and doing the maths to adapt a pattern for yourself, because it just feels daunting to follow instructions that are that dense and navigate through it and make sure you're actually following the size you think you're following. So I wanted to make sure that we could do this in a way where the pattern might be long but was really easy to follow. So hopefully you agree that it works in Gullane. I'm really happy with it. I'm really proud of all the work that went into this from both me and the rest of my team and our amazing preview knitting team. And I wanted to explain a little bit about how I developed the bust shaping. And I kind of went back to basics with pattern drafting and not just looking at what had already been done in knitting patterns. That's not to say that there aren't lots of designers who are doing amazing things with knitting patterns and fit. I just wanted to challenge my own assumptions about what should be done in knitting, what would work, what wouldn't. So I kind of went back to flat pattern drafting, and I got these funny little mannequins. This is a half-size mannequin. It's called half-size. It obviously does not look like half the size of a person. Because you're scaling all the measurements down by half, you end up with something that's more like it's quarter-sized. And these are just used by fashion designers to develop garments because it's much faster to work on. And to me, part of the appeal, honestly, is that it's a lot cheaper than buying full-size mannequins. And I was able to find some in some different sizes and with different figure types. So I kind of started by fitting this mannequin, who is definitely bustier than I am and also a larger size, although obviously tiny. And I started by like working and drafting a like flat paper pattern. Just wanted to show you that in terms of there's not a direct line from that to Gullane because knitted fabric is so different than woven fabric and obviously very different from paper. No one really wants to wear a garment that fits like this either. But it was helpful for working out what shaping is required in knitted fabric and thinking about how to add both width and length. So I'm going to set this aside so I'm not kind of talking around her. But I find most advice, including in like my own book Little Red in the City, on adding bust shaping to knitting patterns focuses either on adding length or on adding width. Either with a horizontal dart, which adds length, and is usually, if you're working, unless you're working sideways, you'd add that with short rows shaping. And alternatively, I've seen guides on how to add width with vertical bust darts. Neither of those options is wrong or doesn't work, but what I've found is that they tend to work better in closer fitting garments, because if you're adding room for the bust, you're adding something, you need more three-dimensional space. You rarely just need more width or more length, you need both. And if you have a close-fitting garment, your body's going to stretch the knitted fabric to kind of where the extra room needs to be. And knitting is stretchy, so if you add extra length, the extra width you need is going to happen by kind of your body will pull that fabric and you'll take up a little bit of the extra length you added and it'll go into being extra width. And it works just fine. Where I was running into issues is adding bust shaping to garments with positive ease. Gullane is intended to fit with somewhere in the 4 to 6 inches of positive ease region, and once you start adding either vertical darts or horizontal darts to that, because your body is not going to stretch the fabric, you've already got extra room. You're not really stretching that fabric, so you're only adding fabric in one direction that you need it instead of both or all, and it tends to just kind of hang weirdly. In my experience, your experience might be different, and that's absolutely fine, and everybody is different, and really every garment is different, and every knitted fabric is different, so your experience might be different. But I wanted to show you this short row dart. I'm gonna bring up our now naked mannequin buddy. I'm hoping these don't get like all my content flagged for nudity or something. And then if I drape this on here, I'm just gonna grab a couple of pins. It's probably gonna go better. And I wouldn't really ever suggest bust shaping in a contrast color unless that's a design detail you want, but it does help to show where the additional fabric is being added. So in an actual sweater, this would fit something like this. It's pretty close fitting. You can see this diagonal line here. This is where short rows are worked to add in this extra wedge of fabric, this extra length to kind of go over the curve of the bust. And it's sort of hard to tell on something so tiny, but you might be able to see where I'm kind of pulling on the corners here, and then this bit here is kind of going this way. I haven't pinned it out. I absolutely could just pull it back and stretch it, and in a close-fitting garment, that's exactly what's going to happen, and you'll get the extra width you need because you'll have that sort of pull happening. What I found, however, with looser-fitting, boxier garments is that putting in short row darts like that, you don't have the body kind of stretching the fabric out at the sides, and you can get kind of a weird indent that makes the garment hang oddly, I suppose, is the best way of putting that. And maybe with some paper that's easier to explain. So if you're sewing, you obviously can't put short rows in, you've got to cut and sew your garment. So a dart is something like this, it's a wedge of fabric, and I just had a straight piece of card, so then when I kind of put the legs of that dart together, do it this way around, can I hold that? Yeah. You can see that obviously this bottom one is slightly longer than the top, so I'd want both of them to be the same length. So I guess I'll just trim that down, we'll see how that looks. But then what happens, I have to grab some tape. Okay, we have tape. So I bring the legs of that dart together. That. Probably should have used some less stiff card, but okay, that's close enough. This way around probably looks better. You can see that this edge here is in no way straight now. So when I wear the garment, my side seam is distorted and it's gonna kind of either pull the back. If it's a stretchy fabric and it's close fitting, it'll probably just kind of stretch more or less into where I want it to be. If it's a loose fitting garment that's either not as elastic or isn't being stretched, then we start getting, well, if this is wrapped around the body, my seam's gonna kind of indent at that point. And at that point where I want it to be widest, I'm gonna have this slightly odd indent. And that's probably not what I want. An indent lower than the bust, closer to the waist, might work, but that's sort of getting a bit strange. So if I trim this down again, I'm gonna eyeball this, we'll see how that goes. So that not sure that was actually a very straight line, but it's at least straight across where this dart ends. If I want like a straight side seam, so that when I, again, wrap my garment around the body, it hangs straight, or I can shape it separately from this bust shaping if I want to. Maybe I want to bring the waist in. Then I've got a nice straight line now, but let's look at what it's like flat if I kind of cut open my dart again. Then it's no longer flat. If you've done any sewing, this sort of shape is probably really familiar to you. It kind of makes sense that if we want our seam to be straight when we bring it together, and we have these angled lines here, it's not going to make sense if we have like a right angle on each one. Those are never going to come together and join into a straight line. The other way to think of that mathematically is if we have this kind of deeper angle here, if our side seam went straight down from there and then straight up from here, the total of those angles would be way more than 180. Whereas here, they're coming together where this angle here plus this angle here adds up to about 180. If my dart was completely symmetrical, more like this, which you could do in knitting, it's just slightly more complicated, then my angles here and here would be different because I would want the total to be 180, so each of these side seams would be 90 degrees in relation to the leg of the dart, not in relation to whatever's going on up here, like at the top edge of my piece of card, or the bottom edge. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And I realized that the kind of problem I was wanting to solve with knitting had already been solved when you were sewing. It's sort of just naturally solved. And I also looked at a lot of guides on how to adjust sewing patterns for knitted fabrics to do what's often called a full bust adjustment in sewing patterns. I think it's a useful term for knitting as well. And usually in knitted fabrics, especially casual garments like a t-shirt, you add more room for a larger bust without putting in a dart. And it's often done by kind of going from like a block pattern, which is like a block pattern is like it's sort of like this, the paper one I showed you earlier on the mannequin. It's like a really close fitting garment that wouldn't actually be very comfortable to move around and wear in, but you can use that as a basis for how to adapt actual garment patterns to fit your body based on that block. And designers use, like sewing designers or kind of fashion industry designers use block patterns and then add ease and design details to those block patterns as part of their pattern development. And if you were doing a full bust adjustment for a knit fabric, often you would be working with a sort of if you were working with a block, you would be working on taking those darts out. And generally what that means is, let's see if I can show you. You basically would, if I have my little cardboard piece, when we add room with this dart here, where we're actually adding the extra room is, if you think of this as the center front of the garment, we're actually adding the extra room here. This the dart here is just where that has to happen because you're cutting and sewing the garment. But if you want to eliminate the darts, you'd basically be taking out that dart, which has a knock-on effect to, I guess a bit more complicated than this because this is a weird pattern shape, but that ends up moving that extra length that you added with the dart down to the bottom hem. And you end up with something more like this illustration, where the short shaping in my knitting is adding this sort of three-dimensional extra room, and it's hard to show that on a flat drawing, so I end up showing that the bottom hem curves. Often if someone is doing an FBA, a full bust adjustment for something like a t-shirt, they'll end up with a really curved bottom hem, and they'll also end up with like a kind of curved shape that mimics the shape I just showed you of my kind of angled side seams when the dart is open. You end up with a bit of a curved shape here when it's flat. When it's sewn together, you don't have a curved side seam because the extra fabric kind of flows into the center and hangs as a straight side seam. I have played around a little bit, and I have considered that you could mimic that sort of full bust adjustment in knitting by putting short rows to add that curve to the hem that will then hang straight, because you're not making a curved hem as a design choice. You can do that, but that's a separate thing. You're adding that extra curve to the hem that will then be pulled up into the bust region to add the extra length where you need it, and the hem will then sit flat. A good guide on whether you need extra bust shaping is simply whether your hems on garments tend to hang straight or get pulled up in the center. If they tend to get pulled up in the center, extra bust shaping is probably going to work well for you. But I have played around with putting in that kind of extra shaping right at the bottom edge with short rows rather than up at the bust. It does work for most people. It feels a little bit unnecessary in knitting because we have that flexibility of adding extra room within our fabric. We don't have to cut or sew anything together. So if we don't want the kind of interruption of a seam, of a dart line, we don't have to move it down to the bottom. However, if you need the extra room in the chest, but you aren't comfortable with something that looks kind of more feminine with obvious bust shaping, it might be something you want to try, because you do still, with a short row dart, get that kind of visible bust line, or that visible dart line. It's more subtle often than a seam, but it can still be visible, so it could be an option for you if you don't want it to look like it has those kind of more feminine shaping details like a dart, to move all of that shaping right down to the bottom edge. It's definitely worth trying. But this is my kind of initial swatch of the bust shaping for, I think this is for the G to H cup in the smallest size. This is my initial swatch, and I wanted to show you this so I could show you the side seam. Obviously it's only part of the side seam, but this makes a really nice straight edge, and there's nothing like pulling that straight. There's no, it's not close fitting to a body that's going to kind of stretch it out here so that that side seam hangs straight. It just hangs straight off the blocking mat. I have said the word straight way too many times now. And that is achieved by increasing. There are also decreases, but obviously I don't have much of my bottom side seam, and because in knitting, it's easiest to add this kind of wedge where you basically have a triangle with an angled top edge and a straight bottom edge. Most of that shaping then is happening above the dart. You're decreasing out the same number of stitches, but you're doing it very slowly to get a much shallower angle below the dart. And you end up with a side seam. You'll see this if you knit the garment flat, that kind of on paper would be shaped like this. But because those dart legs are together, it's not. It's lovely and straight and shaped like this. And I felt like doing that both adds width and length to the bust shaping in Gullane. And it also avoids having the kind of high bust, this measurement across here, being larger than it needs to be for those larger cup sizes, because you're not having to add extra room for the whole of the front. It's just going in that bust area where you need it. So I'm really happy with how this worked. Our preview knitters were really pleased with how it fit, and that it wasn't overcomplicated to knit, although you are doing some increasing and decreasing as well as short rows. It's all very straightforward techniques. Have I got this upside down? Yeah, I think I do. So that is how the bust shaping in Gullane works. And I hope if extra bust shaping is something that you need, that you will give it a try, and I would absolutely love your feedback on it as well. That's how I developed the bust shaping for Gullane and kind of how it works, but how do you know whether you even need bust shaping? First of all, I did mention that if you have issues with your sweaters or t-shirts or whatever it is, kind of riding up at the center front, kind of here, that's a good indicator that extra bust shaping will work well for your body. Another indication is if you struggle to find things like button-down shirts, in woven fabrics, garments that aren't stretchy, that fit well in the chest, in the bust, then that's another good indicator. And part of knowing whether you need bust shaping is also having the measurements to select a size from the pattern. So the best way to do that is to take your actual body measurements. It's easier if you have someone who can help you. And we do have a blog post on taking measurements and choosing a size from a pattern. And there's also a really good taking measurements guide from the sewing pattern company, Cashmere. So I'll put links to both of those in the notes down below. But basically you need two measurements. You need the high bust, which is measured sort of just below your underarm. So kind of here, kind of where the top of my swatch is here. Sort of hard to tell because the mannequin doesn't have arms. But you want the tape measure to go just under the arm, with your arms down by your sides, and then kind of across over the top of your bust. But you're trying to measure sort of straight across at that like underarm line, with the tape measure snugged right up into your underarm, and then measure basically straight across. Generally, it all depends on your individual body shape, but generally if you wear a bra, like especially a more push-up supportive bra, then you'll get a more accurate measurement by taking that high bust measurement without a bra on, and then taking your full bust measurement, which is around the fullest part, around the largest part of your bust or your chest, with a bra on. It depends on your preferences, of course, like what you usually wear, but that will give you a more accurate measurement. And what you're really trying to do there with that high bust measurement is work out what your kind of base garment size, your base body size would be if you had a smaller bust, the sort of average. That it gets complicated because cup sizing is all over the shop in terms of like the letters are different in different countries. There are different guides on how to fit a bra. People are wearing quote unquote the wrong size. or what might not be the most comfortable supportive size for them. So it gets complicated because like I can say these are for these cup sizes, but two people might be the same size but wearing different cup sizes for all sorts of reasons. So it gets kind of complicated from that point of view. But the pattern includes a chart of body measurements, so you can find your high bust measurement and your full bust measurement, and use both of those to choose your size. And that will give you which base size to work from and which cup shaping option you need. The other factor in choosing a size is how much ease you prefer. Ease is one of those terms that sounds really technical, but it's basically, is your clothing bigger than you or the same size as you or smaller than you? You can see really clearly if I stick my arms out that the Gullane Tank is obviously bigger around than my body. So it has positive ease. The garment is larger than my body. Zero ease, or I guess neutral ease, would be if the garment had the same dimensions as my body. At least at the chest in one particular area. If you want Gullane to kind of fit the way mine does, then working the size, that kind of using your body measurements in the body measurements table, working the size that puts you in will give you a similar amount of ease to this and a similar fit. If you like things to not be quite so oversized, or maybe more oversized, then you might want to go up or down a size. And what I would do is I would stick with the sort of, if you're going to go up or down a size, I would stick with the cup shaping recommendation from the body measurements table. So if that puts you in like the size 8, maybe E to F cup, then, and you want a sort of closer fit, then you might want to do the size 7, but still the E to F cup, because that will have the right shape for your body. The other thing that can be really helpful for working out how much ease you like, what sort of fit you like, is to actually measure a garment that you like the fit of. How elastic the fabric is will matter, and how thick the fabric is, because usually if you have like a very thick or very stiff fabric, you'll want a bit more ease so that it's comfortable. But if you have something in your wardrobe, in your closet, that fits well, that you love the fit of, taking some measurements from that and using that as kind of your basis for selecting a size can really help, as well as your body measurements. I mentioned at the beginning that Gullane includes directions for knitting flat and knitting in the round. And part of the reason that we did that was because it's worked in a sort of summer yarn, it's a linen viscose cotton blend, and those fibres have a few characteristics that can mean working flat can be beneficial. First of all, they don't have a lot of memory. If you kind of stretch them, they don't spring back. I have found that Gullane kind of stretches a little bit lengthwise as I wear it, and then it goes back when I've washed it, so I didn't really take that into account in the gauge, but it does have that sort of movement, which makes sense. It's the same as like how jeans stretch out as you wear them and then they bounce back when you wash them. It's very different if you're used to knitting with wool, especially with non-superwash wools that will kind of stretch and then spring back into shape. They've got that memory of how they were, rather than being a little bit slippery. When you don't have that kind of memory from your yarn, it can be nice to have side seams to kind of hold things in place and give your garment a bit more structure, that sort of scaffolding almost, that the yarn itself doesn't have. So side seams can be beneficial for that reason. And there is a third reason you might want to consider side seams, and that's your gauge, or not specifically your gauge, but issues with your tension. It's really common when you're switching from knitting flat, which the top section of Gullane is knit flat. There's not really an option there. You need this part to be open and the v-neck to be open. So the top section is knit flat. It's really common to have a slight difference in your tension, and your actual gauge, like the number of stitches per 4 inches or 10 centimeters that you get, might also be different. And you might find that where you switch from knitting flat to knitting in the round is sort of a noticeably different fabric. And you may find that working with a yarn that doesn't have a lot of memory makes that more obvious, because when your yarn kind of has that memory when you block it, you can sort of even out those small differences. In a yarn like this, it's a bit less forgiving and you might see those differences. So putting in side seams, working back and forth for the whole thing just takes out that problem, because you're never switching to working stockinette fabric in the round. You're just working the whole thing back and forth. Aside from those reasons, which may or may not apply to you, it's really just personal preference. Do you prefer having seams, having a bit more structure in your garment? Maybe you actually find it's more portable, you can work in smaller pieces. If you do want to work in smaller pieces, the front shoulders are picked up from the back. There's no reason you couldn't cast those on and then seam them at the end so that you have a project that's more portable for longer. You can knit the back piece, set it aside, and then knit the front and then seam them together. Absolutely fine. No reason you couldn't do that. The end result will be like pretty much impossible to tell the difference between. If you like knitting in the round, you're looking forward to kind of getting the bits where you have to concentrate and count and do shaping out of the way and having a chunk of stockinette to knit in the round, 95% of the time, you'll make a beautiful garment. It'll be absolutely fine. Do just pay attention to whether your swatch is kind of showing up any potential issues like biased fabric or gauge differences that you'll either want to avoid by working flat, or that you want to find another way to tackle, either by using a different yarn if biasing is a problem, or maybe with gauge differences, playing around with how you hold your yarn, how you knit, how you purl, how your tension's different, or what needle size you're using. Some people certainly switch needle sizes when they go from working flat to working the round. Some people will use 2 needle sizes for the flat portions so that they're always knitting on to a different size for knit and purl. There's definitely ways to tackle that, but just as you make your swatch, pay attention to whether there are any issues that you're going to want to deal with before you get to knitting the body in the round. And the other thing is that plant-based yarns, or sometimes silk, these kind of category of yarns, often I find can bias. I didn't notice any issues with Lina myself. Obviously batches probably vary and your experience might be different, but it's definitely something I've found in the past can be quite a big issue with multiplied linens, especially where the twist that's put into the yarn as it's spun can mean that if you work in the round, your fabric will sort of go like this. If you're not sure what I mean, if you've ever had one of those kind of cheaper, maybe poly cotton blend t-shirts that doesn't have side seams and it feels like the whole thing kind of twists around your body, that's biasing. It's sort of like every stitch is leaning a little bit, and it's just where the twist in the yarn isn't perfectly balanced, and that can be more likely in some plant-based yarns. So one way to handle that biasing or kind of prevent it showing up in your garment is to work flat, to work back and forth, because when you work back and forth, one row of stitches might be slightly tilted this way and one row, but then you're going to flip it around and then the next row as you work it will be tilted slightly this way. So you're kind of creating that balance by working back and forth. Whereas if you knit in the round, that balance, instead of kind of each row balancing the bias of the previous one out, then your bias is just compounded and you get something that actually twists around your body and looks a bit strange and might not be as comfortable to wear. You will, if you knit a swatch in the round, we have a blog post on a quick way to do a swatch in the round. You will see if biasing is an issue. If it's hard to get your swatch to kind of lay flat and it wants to kind of tilt over, then biasing with your yarn might be an issue. And it doesn't mean there's something wrong with your yarn, but you might want to consider working the sort of lower half of Gullane back and forth so that you can counteract that biasing. You can find the Gullane pattern on my website, ysolda.com. There is, of course, a link for you, and it's also available on Ravelry. As I mentioned at the beginning, it really doesn't matter to me which platform you purchase from. It's totally up to you. It works just the same for me. If you've been enjoying these videos and learning more about the work I've been doing on trying to make my patterns more size inclusive and more sort of thoughtfully designed so that they work for all bodies, but Gullane isn't your style or your project queue is already enormous, I would really appreciate if you could support the channel and the pattern in other ways. Simply liking the pattern, liking an Instagram post, sharing those, adding the pattern to your Ravelry queue if you think you'll make it in the future. All of those things make a really big difference to how well a pattern does. So I would certainly appreciate you taking the time to do any of those. And if you found this episode interesting, please do give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you aren't already. And if you're interested in future pattern releases, our newsletter subscribers and network members, the network is our sort of online knitting community. It's free to join. I'll put a link down below. We'd love to have you there. But our newsletter subscribers and network members get an exclusive discount on new pattern releases. So if you aren't already signed up to the newsletter or a member of the network, do go ahead and sign up for those. And yeah, as I said, links down below. Whether you're casting on Gullane this weekend, do share your project if you are with the hashtag Gullane Tank, or you're working on something else. I hope you get some really good knitting time, and I will be back here soon with both another of these podcast episodes and some tutorials that I've been working on. Bye!